Thanks for the invitation. I live in Winnipeg. I've been the regional minister for about 11 years now. It's gone by kind of quickly. So my region is Manitoba, Saskatchewan. So there's about 40 Canadian Baptist churches in that mix. If you remember to pray for Weyburn. Weyburn's been looking for a pastor for a couple of years now, and as a church that's close by that you can continue to pray for, that would be very much appreciated. And I saw the Bandmans at Assembly in May in Calgary, and so I do want to thank you for continuing to be a part of our association of churches. Altogether, there's about 150 across Western Canada. So, yeah, your support is very much appreciated. And it's a long history. At the end of the month, Brandon is celebrating 100 and, Tim, you might remind me, 140 years in Brandon. So we look forward to that. The executive minister will be there from the CBWC for that celebration. And so I think you're invited, just show up. It'll be all right. Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be enough food and all that kind of stuff for you there too. So I apologize in advance. I'm in charge of the remote. Anyways, we'll see how that all goes. But I'd like to clarify that Tim and I had talked about the sermon before we actually, but we hadn't actually talked about how these sermons would dovetail together. And I'm really glad I watched the sermon from last week on YouTube, link that Tim sent, and I think it was great, that kind of thing. So I got to, and I also get to follow up with that particular theme. So I'm really grateful for that. And I do think it's an important one. Living in a secular age, as we attempt to live for Christ in our day and age. And so I wish to speak about the notion of being the church in a secular context, and I shall endeavor to do so by gleaning from portions of 1 Peter. And I'd like to think about 1 Peter more broadly, and we will rely on different passages as we spend some time together. So in my remaining time, I wish to speak maybe about two general ideas, and I hope to flesh them out just a little bit. The first idea is simply, where are we? And the second, what do we do now? Did I press it twice? No, there it is. So I wish to, so in terms of where we are, I wish to talk about where we are by describing three realities that we are immersed in at the moment, or so it seems to me. There's probably more layers to this, but I don't want to be exhaustive on this. And as we might imagine, the world has changed dramatically, especially over the last 100 years or so. And many current philosophers and thinkers would suggest that we find ourselves in a secular age, like Tim talked about last week, summarizing Charles Taylor's work. And being in a secular age means that we now live in a post-Christian, secular context. Our secular context has been described as a virus. So we're all infected. And what they mean is that it has become more difficult to see the transcendent because we're surrounded by human accomplishment. We're surrounded by things like ability, technology, and we're surrounded by this huge emphasis on science. And so we're tempted to think that all that we can see is all that there is. And so it's tough to see past that and to see our need for God or the transcendent, that sort of thing. Churches are also, I think, where we are in terms of the churches are on the margin. I'm ahead of myself here. In broad terms, we live in secular society. Let's also think more specifically about the position of the church in Western society. We may well think that the church once held a prominent position within society and that we should do everything we have within our power to get it back to that influential spot once again. How's that working for us? I think honestly that we must come to terms with the fact that churches are on the margin and they are on the outside looking in. The good news here, though, is that this reflects what the New Testament church experienced as well. The New Testament writers, and especially Paul, always called people out of their situations into the light, into the life of Christ that included being part of the church. The church is supposed to be different than culture, folks. And I get quite concerned, for example, when a church board moderator tells me that, our church needs to catch up with the culture. So if that means that all of the church's values ought to reflect societal values, well, then I don't actually think that that's a fair reading of the New Testament. As one Old Testament scholar writes, if you're a Christian, you're odd automatically. You're not in step with culture. And we need to figure this out as individual disciples of Christ, but also as churches. Please don't assume, for instance, that having outreach events will have the same effect that they once had, right? I mean, the world has changed that quickly. We used to live in a place where most had some sort of history with the church, or maybe they had a religion class in school, believe it or not. Now, we must begin at square one when we encounter someone who wants to inquire about Christianity and about the person of Christ. And so I'm glad for things like your small group topic on apologetics, equipping us to live in the real world, right? A third reality that I wish to mention relates perhaps more broadly and also individually at the same time. It might well be known as the culture surrounding evangelical churches today. To be fair, this isn't limited to evangelicals, but deconstruction season has opened and not many institutions are exempt. What I mean is that we seem to be in a time of dismantling everything from 1980s motorcycles to make them cafe racers, to demolishing old houses for infill housing, to the dismantling of traditional cultural values, norms, and ideologies. Theological deconstruction is also rampant. It is the dismantling of one's accepted beliefs, and unfortunately, many people don't take the time to rebuild those beliefs. I'm sure we all know folks who used to attend church and just can't be bothered anymore. Perhaps COVID chased them away. Perhaps they were burnt out. Perhaps they were hurt by church leadership. There's a long list of perhaps. Perhaps they just don't want to believe any longer. I'm sure you've witnessed this reality in your family and in your town. So what do we do now? We run, obviously. We build a shack off the grid. I think that's what I'm going to recommend. Don't tell anybody where you're going. Grow your own rice, build a chicken coop, learn how to trap animals for protein, and make tea from local pine trees. You're going to be all right. Actually, no. And happily and hopefully we get to turn to the scriptures for encouragement and possibly a way forward. A few years ago now, I read a book by a professor at McMaster Divinity School in Hamilton entitled The Church in Exile, and the guy's name is Lee Beach. Like myself, Lee is interested in the wisdom literature of the Old and New Testaments. And he studied Esther, Daniel, Jonah, Jesus, and Peter to talk about both the theology of exile and the practices of exile. Beach makes the point throughout his book that we in the West live in a post-Christian culture and that the church now functions from the margins as opposed to being at the center. And I think as we look at 1 Peter, we can see that this is exactly how Peter saw the church in his day as well. Though from our vantage point, we may have more church history to deal with, both positive and negative, right? I wish to take you oddly enough, if you have your Bibles, to the end of Peter's letter, chapter 5, and especially at verse 13. And I would suggest that it's easier, an easier translation here is from the New Living Translation, a translation that I often use. There, Peter writes, "Your sister church here in Babylon sends you greetings, and so does my son Mark." Why would Peter end his letter with the phrase, "in Babylon," when he was literally writing from Rome? In fact, if you go to the beginning of Peter's letter, at chapter 1, verse 1, he addresses the letter to God's chosen people who are living as foreigners in the provinces of Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, known provinces of Rome, which are now located in modern-day Turkey. I think we get more of a hint if we use a different translation or version of the New Testament and revisit those opening verses of this letter. I normally use, as I mentioned, the New Living Translation, but if we use the New International Version here, we see that Peter uses the term exiles. And so it reads like this: "To God's elect exiles scattered throughout the provinces of..." And this, I think, makes it clear that Peter was using metaphorical language to make a point. In using familiar language dear to the people of Israel at both the beginning and also the end of his letter, he indicates that although he's writing from Rome, he's also comparing it to Babylon, that city that once symbolized the center of world power, cultural influence, and was the feared enemy of Israel for a very long time. In other words, Peter describes Rome as Babylon because it's a very secular place, a place dominated by anti-Christian values and ways of life. And by extension, this is true for Christians today as we try to live as Christ followers here in the West. We live in a very secular place, a place dominated by anti-Christian values and ways of life, some subtle, some not so much. Much has been written about this, of course, and if it isn't obvious to you yet, living in Canada would qualify as living in such a secular context. And if an author by the name of Doug Herink is correct, the position of exile is meant or perhaps inherent in what it means to be the people of God. It's not a mistake. It's not, right? It's not an aberration, but it's fundamental to what it means to be the church. So providentially, we find ourselves being the church in a secular age, in a secular culture. We're on the margins, we're looking in. So what do we do now? So far, working with Scripture in your current context is what I'm hoping to talk about here. So far, I've been trying to say that our cultural context today is not far removed from Peter's context. As we come to the text in 1 Peter then, I think it's helpful for us to recognize a couple of background ideas that are informative for us today. First, Peter depended on the Old Testament for guidance for his context. He depended on the Scriptures for his context. It has been noted that in the book of 1 Peter alone, there are a bunch of allusions and quotations from the Old Testament. At verse 16 of chapter 1, for instance, Peter directly quotes from Leviticus 11. These sorts of examples show that Peter works with the traditions of which the church was born. In other words, the Scriptures were foundationally important to Peter as he guided his community. And second, while working with those traditions, Peter is firmly located in a context that regarded Christians as strange, superstitious, and disloyal to Roman society. You'll remember that Christianity was a new phenomenon at that time. And thus, what Peter wrote for them has, in a sense, a renewed importance for us in our post-Christian context, as the church, again, is on the margins and not at the center of influence and not certainly at the center of society. I would argue that in a very tangible way, we are missionaries in our own country, our own cities, and our own towns. One author writes that if we're called to be the salt and light in the world, we are required to understand the dominant cultural forces that are shaping both the church and the world around it. We need to be diligent students of our host cultures, something that missionaries have known for a very long time. The challenge, of course, is that being a student of our own culture is more difficult than being a student of a new culture. And one reason that this is so is because we grow acclimatized to our culture and have a harder time seeing the serious threats to a Christian way of life. It's like the frog in the, is it kettle illustration, right? You know, you just kind of, it surrounds you and then it gets too hot. So let's look a little more closely at some of the instructions that Peter has for disciples of Christ in the midst of a situation where the church did not have much influence at all on dominant culture. And we see that we can glean and see what we can glean as we attempt to be a community of faith in a time that has some parallels to Peter's time. Practically, and beginning at chapter 2, Peter talks about respecting people in authority. And he gives instructions for slaves and for wives and for husbands. And in our verses today, he gives further instructions for all Christians. So given the adversarial context they were in, Peter knew the importance of community life, and he wanted the entire community to know how important relationships actually are, even in a very difficult context. We can also see that Peter assumed that his people were embedded in their society to a certain extent. Oh, I missed that. Sorry about that. So let's dive a little deeper concerning being the church embedded in a secular society, starting at verse 8 of chapter 3. I'm going to read chapter 3, verses 8 to 17. Finally, all of you should be of one mind. Sympathize with each other. Love each other as brothers and sisters. Be tender-hearted and keep a humble attitude. Don't repay evil for evil. Don't retaliate with insults when people insult you. Instead, pay them back with a blessing. That is what God has called you to do, and he will grant you his blessings. For the scriptures say, if you want to enjoy life and see many happy days, keep your tongue from speaking evil and your lips from telling lies. Turn away from evil and do good. Search for peace and work to maintain it. The eyes of the Lord watch over those who do right, and his ears are open to their prayers. But the Lord turns his face against those who do evil. Now, who will want to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you suffer for doing what is right, God will reward you for it. So don't worry or be afraid about their threats. Instead, you must worship Christ as Lord of your life. And if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. But do this in a gentle and respectful way. Keep your conscience clear. Then, if people speak against you, they will be ashamed when they see what a good life you live because you belong to Christ. Remember, it is better to suffer for doing good, if that is what God wants, than to suffer for doing wrong. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. First, let's take note who Peter is talking to in these verses. And it seems clear in verse 8 that he is speaking about how believers ought to respond to other believers and to each other. And it seems to me that Peter is calling for understanding amongst the community of faith. Those who belong to this community ought to give each other the benefit of the doubt and should give grace to others considering their circumstances. They ought to be a community that emphasizes unity. This does not mean tensions will not exist, but it will mean that tensions will be held together by a strong sense of loyalty. Additionally, they were to sympathize with each other and try to put themselves in the shoes of the other for just a bit, to help with understanding. He also tells them to love each other as brothers and sisters, being tender-hearted and keeping a humble attitude. In fact, all of these characteristics that Peter talks about require selflessness in order to function. Perhaps theological disagreement is in your midst. Perhaps disagreement around government mandates. Perhaps there's disagreements around outreach and how you do things as a church. Whatever the case, Peter instructs us to be generous to the other in our communities of faith. And at verse 9, it seems a little less clear to me who Peter has in mind as he writes these verses. Yes, it is written to believers, but has he switched his focus from believers' treatment of believers to believers' treatment of unbelievers, of outsiders? Do Christians insult other Christians, or are Christians only insulted by non-Christians? I think, sadly, we know the answer to that. Maybe it's a bit of both. In any case, as we read the prescribed behavior, we certainly see that Jesus is the model for Peter's instructions. Insults are paid back with a blessing, a phrase reminiscent of Jesus' reality on the cross. So in addition to the model of Jesus, Peter reminds his readers that God calls them to such behavior. And to top that all off, Peter builds his case by referring to a psalm, Psalm 34 in verses 10 to 12, which is a long tradition of how people are to live and how they are to enjoy life. In order to attain this life, they were to give up evil in word and deed and to do what is good. And I was particularly struck by this phrase in verse 11, which says, search for peace and work to maintain it. In our society today, we are so polarized, we're so binary and so thumbs up or down and so reductionistic that we have no time for peace, but rather, I want to know, first of all, if you agree with me or not. And if you don't, that's fine, I'll just simply ghost you. I just won't have anything to do with you at all. In doing so, there is no room for dialogue, right? Which is harder work, let's say it. And there's no room for nuance in terms of what we believe or understanding what others believe. This is a real problem, and it seems to me that as a start, at least, we need to get better at listening to each other and striving for peace in a world that seems to be otherwise occupied. I'm terrible with the remote. I'm sorry about that. Peter has further advice for living in an unfriendly society, and we can see this in the paragraph comprised of verses 13 to 17. Verse 13 seems so obvious, but Peter reiterates the importance of doing good in an adversarial environment, and he assumes that Christians are going to suffer. I'll say that again. He assumes that Christians will suffer. In this life, we have so many opportunities to feel mistreated, and perhaps rightfully so. Yet in the midst of these circumstances, we must remember to do good. There is no description, really, of who to do good to. It would seem that Peter wants his audience to be good to everyone that they encounter, because ultimately this relates to bearing witness within the community, or to the community as well. Who would oppose this kind of behavior ultimately? Yet there is a real possibility of being mistreated for our righteousness. Perhaps that means you're standing up for a belief, or you're articulating disagreement with a school policy, or what have you. Doing good does not necessarily guarantee you a lack of trouble, and some of us have experienced this firsthand. Verse 15 suggests that living in difficult contexts does not mean that our worship of Christ ought to change somehow. The context of these verses suggests that there is no secrecy that is necessary as we follow Christ, nor is there a confinement to a place of any sort. This was a lesson that was learned a long time ago for the Israelites, a lesson that was wrought with pain. They had to learn that God was not in a particular place, a particular temple. Instead, God was present no matter where his people were, as evidenced by their experiences in exile in different places. And for further context, you can read the book of Daniel. So living like this, as a witness, doing good, will inevitably elicit a response from those who are watching. And believe me, the world watches and pays attention when we treat others as we ought, and also when we don't. There is no overt proclamation here within these verses about the gospel, no evangelism explosion, no strategy involving 4 spiritual laws. Instead, the emphasis here is that those who follow Christ will be identifiable to those who are watching, which is even harder than running an outreach program, I would suggest, because of their habits, your integrity, and your worship. People will see that, right? And that's an important sort of thing. And when their curiosity is stirred, they will ask about the hope that characterizes us. And when they do, we need to be ready to give an answer to them. Peter isn't recommending an aggressive strategy of evangelism here, and that is not to say it's never necessary, but he does remind his audience that they ought to be prepared to give an answer when questioned, and he assumes that this will happen because of our good behavior. People will notice. Peter further explains his approach by instructing his audience to be gentle and respectful in their dealings with others. And I think this is especially poignant and powerful for us today in our context, much like it must have been then. If the media or social media or what you read in social media are indicators for us, you're not supposed to read the comments, I've heard, right? Never read the comments. Then surely we recognize that society around us is ready to disagree, and loudly when views are not politically correct or what have you. And we need not look only to Christian examples to understand this. If you've been following some of the narrative around climate change or abortion or MAID, for instance, you'll see that many people only want a particular version of events to be presented, right? And if you happen to disagree with that dominant perspective and you put information online about it, well, you should expect swift and severe judgment. Ironically, Christians are disparaged all the time for judging others, while judgments seem to be happening online all the time by Christians and non alike. I don't understand how that works, actually. In the midst of this context, we wouldn't and shouldn't be surprised as disciples of Christ if we are disagreed with as well. But in the midst of this sort of antagonism, we're supposed to be belligerent? No. We're supposed to be gentle and respectful. And I think it's a brilliant way to engage in conversation with others without stooping to patterns that exist within our society. Oh, man. So what am I trying to say, ultimately? As I mentioned earlier, I tried to paint a picture of our time with broad strokes. We find ourselves in the midst of a secular culture, one which no longer has a disposition towards Christianity, and as such, we live in a time that's parallel, I think, to Peter's writings. I've suggested further that it is very important that we understand that we bear witness to Christ in three very important ways: by how we treat each other in our communities of faith, how we treat others in general, and how we respond when we're suffering. Peter assumes that we are embedded in society and does not recommend then that we run to the hills. So I think pragmatically, as we attempt to be the church in this context, and that we take seriously the notion of the church acting as a witness to the surrounding community through the quality of its life together, and then go outside the church and live in a way that continues to bear witness to the people encountered in everyday life. Essentially, I'm not suggesting that you do the latest evangelism strategy or the most outrageous VBS program that you can find and the most expensive one. I think the way forward is much more difficult and subversive than that, and I wish to leave you with three suggestions to ponder and hope embody if you're not already doing so. First, I am suggesting that we understand deeply the culture that we are living in. We may have been living on the same yard for the past 30 years, but times have changed while you've been living on that yard. And we need to understand what those implications mean. Second, I am writing and suggesting that bearing witness in this culture is made manifest when we take seriously the notion of looking after each other within our communities of faith. The love one another passages, if you want some homework this week, go to the New Testament and list all the one another passages and see what it has to say for you in community. It's sobering and difficult, and we're called to it. Third, I am suggesting that bearing witness is further manifested when we see ourselves as sent people to our communities, and that we are intentionally present in our communities, characterized by a readiness to respond with gentleness and respect when people ask about our faith, hope, and actions, and they will ask because of our behavior. Because of our good behavior, to clarify. This will include things like being where the people are, being present with them, being hospitable, blessing your neighbors as you can, not being a jerk at work, and so on. As you may well sense, we all need the Lord's help for this, don't we? And as we serve Him in our churches and in our communities. May His will be done in our lives, in our churches, in our communities. Amen.